Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes running fast if you're the Car Chick. Now, here she is.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Straight Shift. Today we're going to talk about classic cars. Well, the bulk of my car buying business is, normal late model Hondas, Toyotas, BMWs, whatever. I have always really loved classic and vintage automobiles. These days, while there are some cars that are very lovely, they're very beautiful, cars are essentially a tool for transportation, for getting us from point A to point B in our crazy daily lives. And the focus is so much more on the features, the technology, all the stuff, and what the car can do as a tool for us. And that's great, but I think that we have lost the true, pure art of the design of automobiles and the lines of the car and how it makes you feel when you look at it. The cars that were built before 1980, because nothing built in the 80s was good. Clothes, hair, none of that was good. I do like the hairband music, though. I was in high school in the 80s, so that is definitely my genre and my music, but from a design standpoint in many areas of our society, not pretty. But I love the older classic cars. I'm personally a fan of like the 1960s American muscle cars, like the early Mustangs, the Camaros. I also love the elegant cars from the 20s and the 30s, like the Duesenbergs or the hot rod roadsters, like the Mercedes Silver Arrow. I actually have a 3-foot-ish long replica of the Mercedes Silver Arrow Roadster sitting in front of my desk in my office. I'll post a picture of it to my Facebook and my Instagram. It's not just a little replica of that car. It's actually a beer cooler too. The little key is actually the way you open it up, and it's a cooler inside with a drain plug and everything. It's really cool. I've never used it to put beer in, but I could. But several years ago, I started hosting and producing a television show with a buddy of mine called Rust Rescue. Taz is a friend of mine that I got into doing TV with him a number of years ago, but he's been building hot rods since he was a teenager in New York, back in the 70s. And so this has been a passion of his for a long time. And so we decided to do a TV show for the DIY enthusiast to teach people how they could restore classic cars and to do so on a realistic budget. And in the process, I learned so much more about these classic cars and about the restoration process than I ever thought that I would. So many people get bit by the classic car bug at some point in their life. Maybe it was a car that their dad or their grandfather had, when they were in high school, they have fond memories of, or like me, they fell in love with cars from movies like the Shelby GT500 fastback named Eleanor from Gone in 60 Seconds. Either the 1974 original movie or the 2000 remake, they were both really good. And some people just kind of get that urge to find a project car that they can rescue from a barn and restore it in their garage and either flip it for a profit or keep it for their family. And then there are other people who are true collectors who look at classic cars the way other people look at sculptures or impressionist paintings. And they look at something as this is a piece of art to collect, not necessarily to actually drive, but as basically a large motorized sculpture. But no matter what your reason for wanting one of these classic cars, before you just run out and buy one on a whim, we need to talk about some rather harsh realities, shall we say, about buying and owning these classic cars. So, armed with a little information, you can actually develop a plan for getting a classic car that fits your budget and your lifestyle, and you're not going to end up buying yourself a whole load of headaches and troubles. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, why do you want one of these vintage cars? Are you looking for an investment? Do you want a project car, something that you can restore yourself or as a project with one of your kids? Or do you just want to have one of these cars to drive around on Sundays to go get ice cream in or to show off at your local car show? No matter what your reason, we need to go through a few reality checks first. Number one reality check is most classic cars are not an investment. Yes, there are some vintage cars, and these are typically your very rare and very special ones, like the Ferrari 250 GTO, for example, that sold last year for nearly 50 million smackaroos. It set a new auction record. We think that some have sold for higher than that, just privately, person to person, but that was a record for any classic car auction ever in history. But those cars they're like high-end art, and they are expensive. They're already in absolutely perfect condition. They have next to no miles on them, and you have to have a boatload of money to buy one. I mean, you have to have a boatload of money just to get invited to the auction to even see them in the first place. And most of us do not fall into that category. Of course, we've also heard about the person who, found a car in their grandmother's garage when they were cleaning out their estate and, realized, oh, it was worth, so much money. It's just been sitting there and, they turn that for a profit. Those are great stories, but they don't happen all that often. Although we did have a Mustang come into Taz's hot rod shop last year, and it looked just like a fastback Mustang. There's a lot of, classic fastback Mustangs from the 60s. And this one had been tweaked and modified and, messed with by previous owners. It was kind of this hideous Barney purple color. And this guy just wanted Taz to restore it, not to original, but just something that he could have fun and drive. And so we started taking the car, tearing it down to do the body work and put it into paint. And when Taz paints cars, and what any proper shop should do when they paint a car is literally take everything off of it. So we even took out all the seals around the windows. And that's a place where a lot of cheaper shops or just people who don't want to spend the money on a proper paint job, they'll cut corners. And so when the car had been painted Barney purple, whoever did that did not completely disassemble the car to paint it. So when we peeled off those rubber seals around the windows, we could see the original paint color. And it was a dark green. And so we're like, whoa, wait a minute. That looks a lot like Highland green, which was a very specific color of the original limited edition Bullitt Mustangs from the movie. And so we started running the history of this car and looking at the VIN numbers, and it turns out it is one of the very few. There's only a handful of these cars left in the world. And this car fully restored could have been worth $250,000. Unfortunately, it had been altered and tweaked and just messed with by somebody who obviously did not know what they had. And so we were going nuts because we realized what we had found. And unfortunately, the owner didn't care. Either he didn't grasp what we were telling him, or he just didn't want to put the money into it to restore it back to its original glory, which would have taken a lot of work. But wow, we were so just excited to find that this was a true original Bullitt Mustang that could have been worth a boatload of money. But again, that's a rare thing. We haven't seen anything like that come through the shop in years. But, unless you are a true collector, you're not necessarily going to find one of these cars, and you're not going to buy one for an investment. It's just the truth is these cars are old, and there are a lot of costs associated with storing them, maintaining them, even insuring them. Even just driving them can cost a lot of money. So unless you've got 6 or even 7 figures to spend and you're a true collector and you understand the high-end, highly specialized, and highly volatile collector market, do not buy a classic car thinking that it's going to be investment. It is not. It is going to be an inverse investment, meaning you are going to pour way more money into it than you will ever get out of it. That is just the reality of it. Even the beautiful cars that you do see going across the lanes at Barrett Jackson, and they're selling for high 5, high 6 figures. The people that have built those cars, have restored them, and are selling them, they are not making a profit in the grand scheme of things. They have way more money and time invested in that car than they are getting back out of it. These people are true enthusiasts, and they bought it and loved it and drove it for several years, and now they're bored with it and want to sell it and get something else. Or they have put the time and energy and money into restoring it because they love to do it, not because they're actually making a profit when you do look at all of the, hard money costs and their time investment that they put into it. Just doesn't happen. So, myth number 2, or reality check number 2, a classic car is not a daily driver. I know you see a lot of TV shows where the main character drives this gorgeous classic car every day, but that is just not reality. Even the classic cars that have been beautifully restored, they're typically not reliable enough to trust to your daily commute. As I've said, these cars are old, and on old cars, you just never know what is going to fail or break next. And you don't necessarily want to put 12 to 15,000 miles a year on one of these babies anyway, which is what our average commutes tend to be. And classic cars tend to have higher, just normal maintenance costs than normal cars. You can't get them fixed at just any old shop down the road. So a classic car is not a smart daily driver choice. If you do that, you will probably be late to work a lot. Number 3 reality check. Restoring a classic car is going to be way harder, take 10 times longer, and be at least 3 times as expensive as you think it will. My co-host Taz, as I said, he's been restoring these cars since he was a teenager, and since I've been working with him on the Rust Rescue show. The number one thing that I have learned is that things will never go to plan when you're restoring a car, like ever, because there's no true way to really know the condition of any project car that you're looking to restore. I don't care how thoroughly you inspect it or how much of an expert you are. I mean, Taz really knows what he's looking for. He's very good at this. But until you literally tear the car apart, you don't see all the problems. One of the first cars that we bought for the TV show was just a simple 1949 Plymouth Special Deluxe. And let me tell you, there was nothing really special about the Plymouth Special Deluxe. This was what you would call an entry-level family car back in the day. They were cheap then. They're not really worth much restored now. But we saw this one. We liked the looks of it because I love the more bulbous looks of the cars from the 30s and the 40s. And we knew we could do something really cool with this car because we knew we were not going to restore it to its original condition. We were going to hot rod this baby, and we're still planning to. So we were able to pick it up for just a couple grand, and we found it from just a mechanic here in Charlotte that had it listed on Craigslist. And we went and looked at it, and the body was actually in pretty good shape given that this car had been sitting for a while. Frame wasn't in bad condition, although we had a feeling we would probably put the body on a different car frame, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we paid $2,000 for this, which in retrospect was probably a little bit more than we probably should have given what we found. But again, that's just another thing. You'll always end up slightly overpaying because you don't know what you've really got until you get it back to your garage and tear it apart. When we tore out the interior, the car didn't really have traditional floor pans. That's one thing that you're going to find on any project car. The floor pans are always going to be rusted out. You're always going to have to replace floor pans unless you're buying something that's already been partially restored. And so a Fred Flintstone car is kind of standard when you're talking about restoring these things, but we started pulling out the interior. And not only did it not have floor pans, it had the previous idiot, not this mechanic, but whoever he bought it from, had, instead of replacing the floor pans properly, had screwed in just galvanized steel over the holes in the floor pan. And If you know anything about galvanized steel, you do not weld that stuff. When you weld galvanized steel, it releases a zinc oxide, which is poisonous and can kill you. So we're glad that they didn't weld those in. They at least had the good sense to screw them in, but they just screwed them in over all the holes. And instead of making sure the car was, properly watertight and everything, because all of the rocker panels were also rusted out. Instead, they had injected expanding foam into the rocker panels and the A-pillars. So we spent the better part of 2 weeks chipping expanding foam out of the A-pillars of this car. We just cut off the rocker panels, but you would not believe how much expanding foam we chipped out of this car. We're just, oh my God, we were ready to kill someone. But it's just one of those things that you have to laugh about because, one, you can't make this stuff up. And two, it's just the dumb things that people do. So this is the type of stuff that you can find, and you won't find it until you start tearing the car apart. So this is why it's always going to take longer and cost more money than you think it will. You're going to hit the roadblocks. You're going to have to buy more parts and materials than you think. You'll end up buying more tools than you ever thought you would need, tools you didn't even know existed, and not to mention the time commitment. Even professional restoration shops, they can often take 2 to 3 years to restore a car for a client, if they do it right. The average DIYer that's working on a project car just on weekends and in their spare time in their home garage, that typically runs 5 to 10 years. And your spouse is going to love you for tying up the garage for all that time. So before you think you're going to buy one of these cars and restore it yourself, think long and hard about whether you have the time, you have the skills, you have the money, and you have an understanding spouse necessary to take on what's going to be a lengthy, likely expensive, and frustrating project. Yes, in the end, it can be totally worth it, but don't underestimate the effort involved, and make sure you have a really good vocabulary of 4-letter words because you are going to use every single one of them. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about where do you buy these classic cars, what do you look for, and what you might pay for it. We'll be right back after this. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a great price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 704-248-8706. That's 704-248-8706. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
The Car Chick is back for more Straight Shift.
Welcome back. Today we are talking about buying classic cars. Where can you go to find this retro machine that you have always wanted? Buying a classic car is not exactly the same thing as just buying a brand new Toyota or Honda or whatever from your local dealer. You can't just walk in and pick out all the packages you want and pick the color and drive it home that day. It just doesn't work like that. To find a classic car that you really want and to find a good one, it takes a lot of research and legwork. But a lot of my general used car buying advice still holds. You just kind of have to take it to this next level. Places where you can go to buy these. You can buy them at auction. There are lots of classic car auctions, and that can be very exciting. It can be very sexy. And if you think you're going to go to Barrett Jackson, and buy one of these cars. We've seen the classic car auctions on TV, and the stuff that goes through there it's phenomenal. Some of these cars are just so amazing and so unique. But you can't just show up there and start bidding. You have to apply to these high-end auctions and actually submit bank statements to prove that you have a bare minimum of 30 grand in cash to spend on the car. Minimum. And this will get you a seat in the very back row for the cheap lanes. You want to bid on the really nice stuff? You better be able to prove that you have 7 to 8 figures in cash just sitting there in your checking account. But fortunately, there are other types of auctions that the rest of us peasants can go to. And a lot of them are linked to your car shows, your big auto fairs. We've got here in Charlotte twice a year. We have the Food Lion Auto Fair. That's huge. Good Guys is a car show group that travels the country and has these shows. Granted, a lot of this stuff isn't happening right now because of COVID, but there are auctions that normal people can attend. There are even online auctions for classic cars that you can bid on cars anywhere in the country, even anywhere in the world if you know what you're doing. But there are pros and cons to buying cars at auction. On the one hand, you can see some really nice stuff, things that will not necessarily show up at a consignment dealer's showroom, things that have been, beautifully restored, have been sitting in someone's private showroom, their private collection, and now they're selling it. And it's an opportunity to buy some things that you're not going to find anywhere else, but you're also not going to pick it up for $5 grand. You may even get a good deal on it, especially ones that have a low reserve or no reserve. Most auctions, a lot of these cars will have a reserve price, meaning that they're only going to sell it for this is the bare minimum they will let it go for. And if they don't meet the reserve, then they just take it home with them. But again, this does take a discerning eye, and you're going to pay a lot more money for these cars, especially since the Barrett-Jackson auctions being televised over the last, couple decades. People have an inflated view of what the price of these cars should be. And so they think that their car that has been sitting in their garage or in their barn is worth a lot more than it actually is, because it's not anywhere near as nice as what goes across the lanes at Barrett-Jackson. So it has driven up the price of a lot of the more popular classic cars, simply because people think they should be selling for more than that because that's what they see on TV. But again, remember, even though that is a televised real auction, it's still TV, and take everything with a grain of salt. It's not necessarily 100% real, and definitely not realistic. But the cons of buying at these auctions, you have very limited options for inspecting the car. Sometimes before the auction, the cars will be kind of out in a paddock area or queued up, and you can go around and look at them and inspect them. But a lot of times you cannot start them up. You certainly can't do a test drive. They're not going to let you crawl around under them. They're not going to let you pull anything off of them. So it's very much a visual inspection. You've got to look at whatever records they might have for it. So you really kind of, buyer beware. Again, just buyer beware. After you buy it, it's usually yours. There's not like you can return it when you buy a car at auction. There's not any do-overs. Very rarely is there a situation where if you find something wrong on the car, you have any sort of recourse. Plus, you're also having to pay money, not just what you pay for it, what they call under the hammer, the auction price, where the auctioneer goes, blah, 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 sold. There are fees involved, and the seller has to pay a fee to the auction house, and the buyer has to pay a fee to the auction house for the privilege of using the auction house for this transaction. And that can be anywhere from 10 to 25% of the price of the car. So just be aware that those extra fees are involved. Now, most people are going to be looking at classic cars, either buying it from a dealer. And most classic car dealers sell cars on consignment, where it's actually the private owner of that car is letting the dealership put their car in their showroom, and in exchange for handling advertising and detailing and negotiating with the prospective buyers and doing the test drives and handling and facilitating all of the paperwork for the sale, they give a fee to the dealership. They take a percentage typically of the sale for their own profit. And then you, as the seller, get what's left, and the buyer pays the full price. There are a few classic car dealers that will buy the car from the seller and own it and sell it on their lot like they do normal used cars. But with the higher risks and just the volatility of the classic car market, most of them do it on consignment. And the good news with that is, you've got a reputable dealer. They advertise it. It's easier to find these cars. You can negotiate either with the dealership. Some of them let you negotiate directly with the seller, and the seller knows they have to pay a fee to the dealer. It's still typically a private party sale. So, feel free to negotiate as aggressively as you want to. And they'll just say yes or no, just like if, when you buy a car private party anyway. But they also can handle the paperwork for you and just make everything a little bit easier for that transaction. They act as a middleman, which, yes, they make a profit on that. So you're paying that middleman extra price, but they've usually also vetted the seller for you. They know the car's not stolen. They're really good about vetting the title, but they may or may not have all the paperwork. They may or not know a lot of the details about this car, especially if it's a consignment dealer that does a lot of volume and tries to move these cars quickly, because that's the only way that they make money. So you still just need to be very careful and do your research and try to get as much documentation and information about that car's history as you possibly can. But a lot of the time, especially if you're looking for something very, very specific, you're just going to have to pound the pavement and find a private seller. Dealing directly with a seller means you can often get a better price. They might not know what it's worth, especially if it's someone that did inherit this car from, a parent or grandparent's estate. They don't really know what they have. They just kind of want to get rid of it. They may sell it for a very aggressive price for you to just take it off their hands, or they just want it to go to a good home. But it takes a lot of legwork to find that right car, and you're going to be scrounging for sale ads online. You're going to have to do a lot of diligence on your own. Make sure, do they really have the title to this car? A lot of these classic cars, especially if you find them in barns, people have no idea where they came from. They don't come with titles. And then you have to go through a whole nother process of trying to get a title to the car from the DMV. And there's a whole bunch of shenanigans that go along with that, depending on what the state is. And some states are easier than others. So again, you just have to do a level of diligence on these cars that goes above and beyond, if you're trying to buy a 2010 Toyota Sequoia or whatever. You might be better off talking to your local car clubs. There are classic car clubs in every city, every town, everywhere in the country, and they might just know somebody that has one that they're not aggressively advertising it, but they're like, I'd be open to selling it. And if you can kind of go through some trusted people, a friend of a friend of a friend, that can reduce some of the risk, at least in terms of, finding a car that isn't stolen, is properly titled, etc. I've got a client, I buy her normal cars, but she's always wanted a classic car. And she happened to find one. And again, she just pounded the pavement. She had done her homework and she found one for sale by a private seller, a lady out in Washington State. So on the other side of the country from Charlotte, North Carolina. But the woman had the car I think it had belonged to her father. So it had been in her family the whole time. It had relatively low miles on it. She had already done a lot of restoration work on it. So it was a running car in very good shape. She had it inspected. There was relatively little rust on it because they never drove it in the winter. And she was able to get it for a decent price. It was an old Corvair, and they're not, cars that are going to bring crazy money anyway. But she got a really nice, fairly restored. It wasn't a full body off restoration, but it had been well cared for, garage kept car. But I think she paid like $12,000 for it, plus, like $2,000 to ship it from Washington. But it was really worth it to her. And she got a beautiful, beautiful car. She sent me pictures of it. It's lovely. And I thought she did a really good job doing her homework and doing all that legwork and her diligence. And she got the car that she wanted at a very reasonable price. So if you're looking for a car that's already running, that's really your best way to go. But if you are looking for a project car to restore, if you think you have the skill and the tenacity to do this, you have some different options. But the first thing we have to talk about is what to buy and what not to buy. Because with a project car, you have to be even more selective. You may see, a Hudson Hornet, like was, Doc Hudson from the Disney Pixar film. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous car. And you can, if you find one, you can get it pretty cheap. But here's why. It's a terrible car to buy for a DIY restoration because you cannot get parts for it. I don't care if it was in a Disney movie, that was a cartoon. They didn't actually have real parts for it. And that's the number one concern when you are buying a project car. Can you find parts for it? Anything made in the 60s and 70s, even back to the 50s, that's made by Ford or Chevy or even Dodge, Mopar, you're probably going to be able to find parts for it, but don't just make that assumption. I mean, yeah, if it's a Mustang, if it's, Camaro, if it's a Trans Am, yeah, you can get parts for those babies all day long, no issues. But be sure whatever car you are looking at, look at the very specific year, make, and model and start researching online. How hard is it to find parts for this car? How expensive are those parts? Because that is really going to dictate whether or not this is a realistic restoration project. And you also have to look at your own skill level. A lot of classic car restoration involves very heavy body work. If you can't find parts, a lot of times you have to fabricate parts, especially with the older cars. And fabricating parts, you have to have metal fabrication tools and mad skills to do it. This is why the restoration guys, the really good ones, like the guys you see on TV, this is why they make big bucks. It's so expensive to restore those cars because that is a lot of manual labor that goes into painstakingly fabricating all the body panels and parts for those cars, whether they're just having to fabricate panels to take it back to original, or if they're doing a custom hot rod situation like Taz does. It's just a lot of freaking work, and it takes very expensive tools and a level of skill that the average person simply does not have. I would not touch any of that with a 10-foot pole. Taz is really good at it, and he's been accumulating the tools to do it. But for the average DIYer, most people are not going to have fabrication skills at that level. And you also need to look at what level of support do you have in your community. Is there a classic car club in your area that has people that have cars like this, that maybe have done a lot of restoration work on their own, that you can call up and be like, hey, I need help. Do you have advice on this? Do you have advice on that? One of the things that we've been restoring for Rust Rescue is a 1945 fire truck. Yeah, so this is an example of what you do not want to buy as a DIY project. And it's taken us, we've been working on this dang thing for 2 years. And, bless the owner's heart. He has been so patient and he understands why this is taking forever. Plus, we're also doing it on TV time, which takes 10 times as long anyway. But, our biggest problem has been figuring out even what kind of chassis it's built on. It's a Chevy. We finally were able to get in touch with the world's leading authority on antique fire trucks, and specifically the orange Chevy fire trucks. And he was able to tell us so much. But even finding parts for it, yeah, it's a Chevy, and technically it takes normal, I use the word normal loosely, Chevy parts, but it's a 1945. So those parts are not going to be in the computer at your Chevy dealership. They're not going to be at the computer at your average parts store. They're going to be in the old-fashioned paper catalogs, and you've got to try and bring in the old part and sit there with the catalog and hope that there's somebody at the parts store that actually cares enough to help you painstakingly go through it and look for those parts. Or you call up somebody else that has done that restoration and be like, dude, what's the part number for this? Do you know? Have you done this? So you need to have the proper level of support. So don't try to restore a fire truck on your own. The other thing that you can do, and what I said earlier we were doing with our 1949 Plymouth project, is we knew that, this was an old frame, it's old suspension, it had what basically looks like a sewing machine for a motor. We knew that we were not going to keep any of that stuff. It's not worth anything restored or original. Anyway, we bought it because we just liked the lines of the body and we knew we could hot rod the crap out of that thing. So, and this is very popular to do with restoring classic cars, especially, it's called retro modding. And basically, you take the body of the car off of the frame, which is a really interesting effort to begin with. We used a tractor with forks on the front and ratchet strapped the body to that. And once we disconnected everything, lifted the body off of the frame using a tractor. Yeah, and we did it for the show. It's on video. You can watch it on our YouTube channel. It was so sketchy and so dangerous, and we do not recommend doing it that way at home. But we mounted the body of the Plymouth we took a Chevy S10 frame. We just found a junked Chevy S10 old pickup truck from late 90s, early 2000s, I can't remember. And we had to extend the frame. We had to cut the frame in half and build a middle section and weld it all back together. And again, this is not what the average DIYer is going to have the skill to do, but we knew how to do it. You would think that a pickup truck frame would be long enough, but you wouldn't believe how long some of these old cars are. I mean, they called them land yachts for a reason. So we actually had to extend the S10 frame, and then we mounted the Plymouth body back onto that Chevy S10 frame. Well, now we've got no problem finding parts. We can put a modern suspension on it. We can put normal disc brakes on it. And we're probably going to end up putting a Chevy motor in it just because we have Chevy motors laying around the shop like you wouldn't believe. And so we made that decision to do it. But again, we had the tools, we had the skills, and we had the inclination to do it because we're building a hot rod. The average DIYer is probably not going to have that combination of things to do it. But if you do, go for it. It's really cool. Just be careful and don't use a tractor to take the body on and off of the car. And finally, you also want to look at your exit strategy because even though you're in buying mode now, eventually you may want to sell this thing. And so you need to look at what am I going to realistically sell this for? And this is where people get in trouble thinking they're going to buy a classic car and they're going to restore it and then they're going to sell it and turn a profit. Again, that frequently does not happen, depends on the type of car. We will be able to flip this Plymouth and sell it for a profit because we're building it as a custom hot rod and we're building it on a TV show, which gives us like artificial credibility and inflates the price of the car. But when we're done with it, it's going to be really cool. But, we're not kidding ourselves that we're going to sell it for $100,000. Honestly, it's still not going to pay for the time that we've invested in it, but we'll at least get the money back out of it that we put in it in parts and fabrication and all of that. We do also have a 71 Mach 1 Mustang, which is just like the one that James Bond drove through the streets of Vegas in, I think it was Diamonds Are Forever. And that car fully restored is worth some money. So if we ever get around to actually finishing that car, that one we might be able to sell, for about 70 or 80 grand, depending on what we do with it. So that's one of those rare cars that we picked it up for, I think, $1,500. It's going to have a lot of labor and love in it, but we probably will be able to sell that one for a true profit. But again, that's a rare car. But as a rule of thumb, the more money you pay up front on the car, assuming that you're not overpaying, that you're truly paying for condition and quality of the car, that's going to save you money later on. So here are some things to look for when you're looking for a project car. And again, you're going to find these project cars on places like Craigslist and car club websites and forums. You can find them in junkyards, barnyards, backyards, word of mouth, just driving around. Just down the street from me, there is, and I haven't looked to see what it is, but it's definitely from the 50s. I haven't been able to tromp into the person's lot to really take a look at it, but it's been for sale forever in their front yard, and it looks awesome. It's got the looks of the Hudson Hornet, but it's not a Hudson Hornet. Then there's a guy down the street from that always has 2 or 3 classic Volkswagen Beetles sitting in his front yard that he sells. I have no idea where he finds these things. Those cost a lot of money to restore. Those parts are not as cheap as they used to be. But like I said, you can find these project cars everywhere, but you have to be really, really careful what you look for. So the first thing you're looking for is rust, and more rust. And where is that rust? They're all going to be rusty. But is it surface rust? How rusty is the body? How rusty is the frame? Is there expanding foam in there anywhere? This tells you just how much restoration work you're going to need to do. If the body is in good condition and not rusted through, then you may be able to just, sand it, take it down to bare metal, and then do a good paint job on it. You're still going to have to do a little body work with sanding and filling and to make it all nice and smooth and prep it for a good paint job. But you may not have to replace or patch body panels. Really try and look at the frame, which is hard to do on a lot of these cars, especially if they're sitting in a barn or a field somewhere. But if that's the case, then just assume that you're going to have to take the body off the frame and restore the frame. And what we do, we pretty much on most of the cars that Taz works on, unless it's something that came to him already in pretty good condition, all of our rust rescues, we do take them down to the frame and do all the prep work on the frame. And then we coat everything in a product called Zero Rust, which is, we love this stuff. It's not like Rust-Oleum or anything like that you buy at Home Depot. This stuff truly bonds to the metal and stops and prevents rust at a chemical level. It's amazing. And they've been such great partners with us on the TV show. So we use it on everything. But that's a lot of work again. And it's going to take a lot more time, and you have to really understand, how to restore the frame of a car. Body off restoration is a whole nother animal. But let's just say, okay, the frame is good. The body looks pretty good. Does it run? Does it even have a motor and a transmission? And if it has one, does it crank? Does it turn over? A lot of these motors have seized because they've been sitting for so long. And when you take the motor apart, there is this mixture inside of gas and oil and something that looks like 3-day-old coffee. I mean, it's just nasty. And so you're always going to have to tear those motors apart and rebuild them. At best, you're probably going to have to do a refresh where you partially tear it apart and replace all the seals and gaskets and rubber parts. But this is where you need to have someone who is truly a mechanic who knows what they're doing to take a look at it and see is the motor even rebuildable. And you may not know for certain until you get it torn apart. So again, this goes into how much am I willing to pay for this car given how many unknowns that I have. And a lot of the time it just makes more sense to just get a motor for it, drop it in there, and not even try to mess with the one that is already in there. This is why we have a whole bunch of 350 Chevy motors just sitting around our shop. We find them when we buy them and we put them in everything because they're easy to use. But again, this is where you should have the car inspected. And unless you are that expert yourself, you need to bring someone with you or send a true professional inspector to take a look at the car. Someone who knows about not just cars, but truly the classic cars. Sometimes a restoration shop will have someone that they can send out. A lot of them are so busy that they don't have time to go out and look at project cars for people, even if you're willing to pay them good money to do it. But some do. You can, if they're going to do that and you plan to have the car professionally restored, they can give you an estimate of, yes, this is what the car's worth, and here's kind of roughly a range of what we think it will cost to restore it. Take that number, multiply by 3. That'll be a little more realistic. Even the Lemon Squad, you know how much I love Andy and his team over at the Lemon Squad for pre-purchase inspections on used cars. They do have a classic car inspection. It's more money, obviously, than inspecting like a 2012 Toyota. It's about, I think, $270, but that's well worth it for them to send an inspector out. But they don't typically inspect project cars. It does need to be a running classic car that you would find at a consignment shop or from a private seller. If you're looking at a project car, you just hope to try and bring someone with you that knows what they are doing. So there's a lot of different ways that you can acquire a classic car depending on how much time, money, and headaches you want to spend on this. There are a lot of great options out there already in beautiful running condition that you can buy and be on the road this Sunday to go to that ice cream store. Just depends on what you want to do. So I hope this information has been helpful and will save you from making a really big mistake buying the wrong classic car. But hopefully it will bring you the joy that these old cars bring to us, and we won't lose this important part of American automotive history. If you want to check out the Rust Rescue TV show and see some of the ridiculous and crazy things that we have done on that show, you can find us on YouTube by searching Rust Rescue TV or go to rustrescuetv.com. I'm out of here, guys. I got to go work on a fire truck. See you later.
The Straight Shift podcast is copyright Leanne Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of Leanne Shattuck or The Car Chick.